Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. This will be airing on Friday, November 7th. It is being pre-recorded, so I think what we will do just after a couple words is get right to the subject. This week has seen the demise of Dick Cheney, a long-time target of the LaRouche movement for his lying wars all over, particularly Southwest Asia. He died at the age of 84, and it's unknown whether he actually had a heart at the time he died or not. The other major development, which came as a shock but should not have, is that a 34-year-old Muslim Democratic Socialist, Zoran Mamdani, will be the next mayor of New York City. And this is more due to the failings of the political class than to his brilliant tactics, although he is smart and he did a good job. But also you had an enormous angst and anguish in New York City over the genocide being perpetrated by the Netanyahu regime, by Israel against the Palestinian people, backed up by the United States. And people had had it. They had been in the streets and they took their voices to the electoral process, which is very normal in the United States. The other benefit of this is that Governor Hochul was hoisted by her own petard because she had done so much to get rid of Cuomo, although herself being a committed Zionist, I'm sure she would have preferred to support him, but how could she do that after the witch hunt she ran against him? So she was forced to come into the Mamdani camp. And then you had Curtis Sliwa standing on his own principles, with 7% of the vote being called a spoiler. But you do have to ask yourself, there was great anger at Cuomo for sending elderly people infected with the COVID virus back into the nursing homes, leading to a rapid spread of the disease and many deaths that probably didn't have to occur. Where is that? No one remembers it anymore. So like Hillary Clinton in 2016, what you see is the political class totally out of touch with the population moving as Americans do, which is you take your grievances to the ballot box and you hope that there will be a fair, legitimate election, which is a big question. And now our fight in the LaRouche movement is that after such an election, you don't get to go home and sit on the couch and be a couch potato, but that you are active, educated, and you fight for the policy needed. Now, a few weeks ago, we began a series of symposia on the rapidly approaching 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the 250th anniversary of our founding. And I'd like to bring on my two colleagues, Bob Wesser, who was the historian for my Senate campaign and historian for the LaRouche Organization, and my husband, Christopher Sare, also, who has done a great deal of work in was turned off. He and Bob Wesser are going to together present part 2 on George Washington. The first part dealt with the period leading into the American Revolution, leading into the inauguration of our first president, George Washington. And what will be discussed today is what happened when he became president. What was this institution of the presidency? And how did he think about it, which I think current presidents and those thinking of becoming president would do well to consider. So with that, I guess I should turn it over to you, Bob. Is that the...
Yep.
Okay, very good. Go ahead.
So let me get... all right. So I think if you ask most people, most Americans, tell me about President Washington. What did President Washington do as president? Most people would have absolutely no idea. He was the first president. Probably most people wouldn't even know he served 2 terms. So it's this kind of nebulous, ethereal nothing. in most people's minds. And there's a reason for that. This is why I started with this painting, which was done in 1802, shortly after Washington died. It's called The Apotheosis of Washington. And it's not meant to be a slander, but what, I mean, look at it. He's rising out of the grave and ascending to heaven as like a god or Jesus, or, you know, reminds me of Raphael's Transfiguration. So this was done right after Washington died. There was all these, you know, crazy, narratives to make this guy into some kind of untouchable god. You know, nobody can ever be like Washington. I'm sure this is somewhat deliberate, though I would have to research it. Then you had things like Parson Weems' biography of Washington, which he wrote right after he died, where he just made stuff up. Oh yeah, he chopped down the cherry tree and, you know, didn't lie about it, and he threw a silver dollar over the Potomac. This is all nonsense. It never happened. But for some reason, if you're a god, you know, or Moses, he was compared to Moses, you can just kind of make up all these stories. So this is a national tragedy, because in reality, it's George Washington that forged not just the presidency, but the whole way the government, the constitutional government in the United States actually functions and could function, you know, in perpetuity. And Washington was absolutely passionate about the idea. You see the little quote on the bottom. He considered the Constitution, which he was very, very deeply involved in creating, right? He considered this to be nearer to perfection than any government hitherto instituted among men. That's a strong statement, and I would agree with it. You know, and we'll see why. Now, just as a refresher for people that missed part one, remember, this is the guy who was committed to breaching the Appalachians, going into the Ohio country, building canals, using higher technology, developing the whole continent for the benefit of mankind, for people, you know. So that's his orientation. And, you know, this is kind of stopped in 1763 after the end of the 7 Years' War, where the British draw a line, which is the 1763 proclamation line. You can't go further than this line. You're not going to be settling Western territories. Forget about it. You're just a bunch of colonies. Just get back in line. So that's just by way of. So this is not some guy that just popped on the scene as a general in 1775. There's a whole history to this, and you can go look. I'm going to put the link in the at least in the YouTube comments to the first part of this, so you can review that. Okay, so American Revolution, 1776, Declaration of Independence. Most people, especially New Yorkers, are very familiar with this statue, with this image of the New Yorkers tearing down the statue, and I've seen this reproduced in our own publications, and people say, yeah, that's great, and then they melted it down, they made it into bullets, and Washington was completely horrified by this. Because the army participated in it. It was like a few days after the Declaration. I think it was like on the 9th of July or something. So he says the whole incident had the appearance of riot and want of order. And that's, if we're going to do such things like removing these statues, they should be done with proper authority. And keep this in your mind. We'll come back, because you say, well, what is he, just some straight-laced, you know, upright guy, and he's against these kind of things? And no, all right, there's something else going on. And just keep this rattling in the back of your mind as we go on. Okay, so we win before we win the revolution, the Continental Congress creates these Articles of Confederation. There's no executive, there's no branches, there's just the Congress. And, you know, this is a big problem. It's a huge problem during the war, because Washington's constantly getting in conflicts with the Continental Congress over money. And then, of course, it's the Continental Congress, so they're always squabbling among themselves. You know, a lot of times nothing can get done. He has to go to private financing to keep the army in the field, which is what Robert Morris did in Philadelphia, who ended up in debtor prison, you know, because we had no government that could actually functionally do this. So this is not going to work. So after we win the revolution, it's clear to the leadership of the country that we need a new form of government. And for the months between May and September, May 1787, they convene in Philadelphia. Now, who's the president of the Continental Constitutional Convention? George Washington. So he's there the whole time. And I just want to take a minute and refresh people on the battle. What's going on here? Well, you have Jefferson, who's, if you can look at it, I don't know if people can see the detail. He's kind of like whispering in Ben Franklin's ear, And there's a bunch of other guys on the left, seem to be pointing at Washington or something. So there's a big conflict because the Southerners, the plantation guys, Jefferson and others, they don't want some big, strong executive telling them what to do. This has got to be the people have to run the Congress. The legislature has to run the country. And so there's a battle, but Washington, Hamilton, and others know if there's not a strong executive, like the way Washington was the commander-in-chief during the war and picked his own people to work with, and therefore could win. If you didn't have something like that, we weren't going to have a country. We were in debt. It was a mess. There's no way it could have been kept unified. So they're fighting for this. So what they have to do is they have to go to the agrarians, the Southerners, and say, okay, look, if you give us this strong central government, here's what we'll do. We'll allow you to count 3/5 of your slaves in the enumeration that determines the number of people you have in the Congress from your state. So that's the compromise. Now, remember, these are slaves. They're not counted for anything. They don't vote. They're not counted in the census. So the Federalists are saying, we'll let you count 3/5 of them. And this is always said as 3/5 of a man, et cetera. Well, in reality, this is what it is. So the Southerners say, okay, and of course, the other compromise is the Congress can pass no law until 1820 that, abolishes or makes slavery illegal. So these are the compromises, but without these, we would not have had a federal republic. And I want to make that absolutely clear. So to make sure that the Constitution is ratified, especially in New York, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, secretly, nobody knows who wrote them. They have these names like Publius, etc. Produced the Federalist Papers from October 87 to April 1788. And this is very interesting. I don't think it's any accident that the three authors of the Federalist Paper end up in the three branches of government. So Hamilton is in the executive as the Treasury Secretary. Madison, for better or for worse, usually for worse, is in the Congress, kind of the leader of the Congress, the legislature. The first article of the Constitution. And John Jay is, of course, the Supreme Court Justice. And these are the guys that actually author it. So they're going to obviously have some commitment to actually make this three branches of government function. So April 1789, Washington is inaugurated in New York City at Federal Hall, which of course was the first temporary capital. There's a whole kerfuffle. What are we going to call the president? What's his official name? And John Adams wanted to have this whole, His Highness, the Defender of Liberty, the one and only, and Washington said no. The official title is the President of the United States. And that stands today, right? You see the president comes in, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. So that's Washington set that as a very simple, no ornate, title or anything. So he gives the first inaugural. That's the other thing. There's nothing in the Constitution saying the president's supposed to be giving a speech after he's sworn in, but Washington gave an address. And ever since then, presidents have given an inaugural address, right? So that's quite interesting. But look at how he's looking at this. He knows what's at stake here. This has to work. So he says, the magnitude and difficulty, this is in the address, of the trust to which the voice of my country has called me, could not but overwhelm with despondence one who inheriting inferior endowments from nature and unpracticed in the duties of civil administration ought to be peculiarly conscious of his own deficiencies. So he's saying, hey, I'm no great shakes, especially in politics, but I have to do this on behalf of the nation. And then it also gives you an indication of how he's thinking of this, right? So he says, I'm just going to read the top part. By the article establishing the executive department, it is made the duty of the president, quote, to recommend to your consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. So Washington says, well, the circumstances under which I now meet you will acquit me from entering into that subject further than to refer to the great constitutional charter under which you are assembled, and which in defining your powers designates the objects to which your attention ought to be given. So don't look to me for it. I'm not going to tell you what to do. We created it. It's all in the Constitution. And you, gentlemen, are now responsible, along with myself, for making this a reality, for bringing this to light. Another innovation is, in the Constitution, it says, well, in the second article 2 on the executive, it says, well, the president can require the opinion of principal officers in each of the executive departments. It doesn't delineate that at all. So Washington creates this idea of a cabinet. This is the first, right? It doesn't say in the Constitution the president should, set up a cabinet and meet with them. No, there's nothing like that. And of course, it's the first team of rivals, because Washington wants to make sure that there are people representing all these different factions in his government, in his cabinet. So you have Henry Knox as the Secretary of War. He's on the right there next to Washington. In the center standing is Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, Jefferson, Secretary of State. They, of course, become bitter enemies, which is what we're gonna look at. And then you have Edmund Randolph as the first Attorney General. And Washington insists any big issue that comes up before the presidency, all of these men are to submit in-depth papers and disagree with each other, on how to approach it. And then they're all going to be read by Washington, and then they get together and they deliberate on what should be done. Very much the way he ran the Continental Army. I'm not saying his generals, but his very close people, his aide-de-camp, Hamilton, effectively chief of staff, etc. So this is a fun one. So of course it says in the Constitution, the Senate, the president can enter into treaties only with the advice and consent of the Senate. So it says advice. So you're supposed to go to them and say, what do you guys think we should do about it? So Washington thinks this is nuts. I'm not going to go to them for advice. I know what to do. So a couple things happen right in the beginning, and he sets the tone of the powers of the presidency. So first of all, there's a minor executive officer that he's appointing. Again, the Constitution is unclear on this, whether this should be done in conjunction with the Senate or the president or whatever. So some guy is opposed to this in the Senate, and Washington gets word this guy's going to try to stop it. So Washington jumps in his carriage, rides down to Federal Hall, which is not so close, right? I mean, he lived where the Brooklyn Bridge is, and Federal Hall is like way downtown, and enters the Senate, which at that point is on the second floor of the federal building, he basically, and they're all like shocked. What is this guy doing here? All right, and he basically forces the issue. They're all embarrassed because they didn't think the president would show up like this, and they end up saying, okay, look, you can just appoint these kind of people. That's fine with us. So that sets a precedent. And then the second thing is he deploys Knox to write up a treaty to deal with the Creek Indians, I think, which were in Georgia. And basically the treaty is we're not going to go murdering the Indians. We're going to meet with them. We're going to negotiate. We're going to give them money for land if we have to, etc. And some corrupt elements in the Senate from Georgia, because they probably have interest in that land and whatnot, try to block this, get all upset. So Washington, again, goes down to the Senate and insists that the entire treaty is read to the entire Senate so people know exactly what the whole thing is about. And he wins it, and they do, consent to the treaty. And never again does the president or this president, I don't think any other ones, go to the Senate for advice, simply for the consent. Yeah, so that kind of sets a standard in terms of the power of the presidency. Okay, so immediately, what do these guys do? In January 1790, Hamilton issues the report on credit. A year later, the report on the national bank. So they're going to establish a national bank, consolidate the debt, allow credit, right? And this is all going to be done from the power of a central federal government so we can build the nation and expand it and protect ourselves against the oligarchical private banking of the empire. There's a big fight about this because the Jeffersonians and company, they say, you can't have the federal government making a company that runs us and blah, 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 So Hamilton has to write the Constitution of the National Bank, constitutionality of the National Bank to prove that this is constitutional, and then later the report on manufacturers. So the two bank acts, bank bills, I think they called them, passed in 1791. So what happens? Jefferson goes completely bonkers. And these are direct quotes. He says, this whole thing, this is designed to prepare the way for a change from the present Republican form of government to that of a monarchy, of which the British Constitution is to be the model. What? And then later he accused Hamilton and his allies of preaching up and panning after an English constitution of kings, lords, and commons whose heads are itching for crowns, coronets, and miters. Where is this coming from? It's bizarre, right? Not only that, but then he brings into Philadelphia, the capital's now been moved to Philadelphia, this kind of crazy person named Philip Freneau. And I'm not going to go through the story. He was a poet. The guy's a weirdo, really. But there's a whole backstory to that. Anyway, at that point in Philadelphia, the paper on the left, called the Gazette of the United States, is the official kind of pro-Federalist, pro-Hamilton paper circulating in Philadelphia. So Jefferson brings this guy in to create the National Gazette. And this paper, and this guy Freneau is just relentless. Washington, these guys want monarchy, they want absolute power. And it even gets to a point where he, pens a broadside that's on the bottom, the funeral dirge of Washington, Wilson, King, and Judge. Remember, James Wilson was really the designer of those compromises that got the executive and designed kind of the executive branch. And apparently it showed a cartoon of Washington with his head in a guillotine. I mean, this is wild stuff. This is in Philadelphia. The other person that they recruit to do this kind of work, this dirty work, stirring up the rabble-rouser, the mobs, etc., is Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, and he puts out a paper called the Aurora General Advertiser. And it's the same thing. It's relentless. These guys are going for tyranny, monarchy, blah, 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 blah. And of course, Washington, he writes to Jefferson, and now, he doesn't react to this. It's not like what Adams does later when with the Alien and Sedition Act and arresting people and shutting down papers. He's not doing that. He just doesn't respond to it. But he does write to Washington. He says, these articles tend to produce a separation of the Union, the most dreadful of calamities. And whatever tends to produce anarchy tends, of course, to produce a resort to monarchical government, idiot. So you guys preaching against monarchy, you're going to create a mob, and everybody that read Plato since till then knows that that's the case. That is ultimately what happened in France, right? You had the Reign of Terror, the bloody, insane, quote unquote, revolution. And what's the end result? Napoleon, a dictator. You know, everything that they say that they're against. But there's something else going on, in case you may have wondered. And what's going on is those lovable British Whigs. So now people, Americans, and if you learn history and high school, oh, those are the guys, the Whig. They were against the king. They were for the people. They were against the General Warrants and blah, 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 right? So that's not what they were for. They were against the king because Shelburne and Pitt and others wanted to create, seeing the handwriting on the wall of the American Revolution, right? You know, Shelburne and Pitt were the ones that were always saying to the crowd, get out of the war. We shouldn't be fighting there. Pull the troops home. Of course, here people thought, oh, gee, those are our friends of the Whigs. You know, they're against the king and blah, 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 blah. Well, the real design was this new, bright and shiny British Empire, destined to cover the surface of the globe. The sun never sets on the empire. That wasn't the case in 1784. That's what they were going to create. And you have the India Act in 1784. This essentially, Shelburne, and this guy's one of the most evil people in modern history, in my view, because he consolidates the power of the British government, the British East India Company, banking, and intelligence in kind of one blob. And that becomes the empire. And all the horrible things you hear about India and everything else, slavery, etc. So what they do is they release the Wealth of Nations, promoting free trade and, you know, open your ports and blah, blah, blah. That's in 76 when you have the Declaration of Independence. The next year, they don't want to end up like the Roman Empire, so they commission, the British East India Commissions ends up being Gibbon to write a whole history of the fall, rise and fall, decline and fall of the Roman Empire, because we're going to be the next Roman Empire. We're not going to make the same mistakes. And then Pitt the younger brings in Jeremy Bentham, Shelburne, really, and Pitt. And his job is to completely destroy any moral opposition to this crap. And so he writes a defense of usury, a defense of pederasty, and on and on and on. So that's what's up. That's what these guys are doing. Now, whether, yeah, this is just, I'm not going to read this. Oh, actually, I will read this. This is from the same period, exact same period, you know, right at the end of the American Revolution. This is the East India Company director, Sir Francis Baring, also the head of Barings Bank, right? And what does he say? He said, the two great objects for this country, Britain, are to check the Americans in their circuitous voyages, i.e. restrict their trade, block development, and to prevent their interference with our fisheries. These 2 points secured, I would concede to them almost the whole of what remains, so long as they do not pretend to be a manufacturing company. So that's what's up with the new Shelburne British Empire. So exactly in this period, 1785, 1786, Jefferson is in Paris representing the new American, independent America. And he writes the only book he's ever wrote called The State of Virginia. And he does it in conjunction with Shelburne's buddies in Paris. In fact, they translate it into French. And I'm going to read this whole quote, because this really gives you an idea of what the heck is going on. So part of it, he says this: those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his particular deposit for substantial and genuine virtue. Is the focus in which he keeps alive that sacred fire, which otherwise might escape from the face of the earth. Corruption of morals is the mark set on those who, not looking up to heaven, to their own soil and industry, as does the husbandman, for their subsistence, depend for it on the casualties and caprice of customers. That is commerce, right? So you got to be, digging the sacred land yourself. The mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as soars due to the strength of the human body. And then the rest of the quote, he calls for all doors of commerce to be open, free trade, etc. So that's what's up. So whether he knows it or not, Jefferson is part of a concerted effort by the British Empire to create this new Roman Empire monstrosity. And he is an operational element of that. I don't know if he realizes that that's what he's actually doing, but all these attacks on Hamilton and Washington are that, right? That's where they come from. I'm going to address this real quickly. The way that these guys, Shelburne and company, are maintain power in England at that point, factions of people in the parliament, etc., the way that they actually do things is through mobs. They instigate mobs that go down and burn people's houses and kill people and murder people, and etc. It's a well-known thing. And the mobster that Shelburne deployed to great effect right after the Paris Treaty of 1763, which they were peed off at because they thought it gave up too much to the French. But anyway, is this guy John Wilkes, who's this crazy member of parliament and who produces this paper called the North Briton, which attacks the king. So they put out this broadsheet, and these papers attacking the king, and they instigate mobs to support it. Right? Sound familiar? Then he writes a famous issue of this called the issue number 45. And in issue number 45, he attacks the king personally and directly. He's tirade, blah, blah, blah. Of course, remember, this is all towards Shelburne's end of, bringing the monarchy into his private company, British East India Company, a project. So, and here's a mob after, they try to throw Wilkes in the tower. A mob comes out and they try to stop it. Now, I'm bringing this up because if you were walking around Boston in the 1760s, you would see everywhere 45. People's windows, on plates, on signs. This is the number 45 of the New Britain that Wilkes produced attacking the king. And you'll see this. This picture is a picture of a silver punch bowl made in 1768 by Paul Revere. And it says number 45, Wilkes and Liberty, blah, blah, blah. So this is a problem, right? So the Americans seeing this say, oh, this guy's against the king, And so this constant problem of, mobocracy, I would call it, or people just descending into mobs and tearing things down, etc. This is a problem in the United States, and that's what Jefferson is playing off on. This is just another indication, which I won't go through. So you have the Reign of Terror, and by 1794, you have the execution, the beheading of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and all that stuff. That's what the picture is. So Jefferson says, yeah, this is it. This is the way to go. He goes, I think these guys, they're the spirit of the revolution of the whole country, of all of France. So he wholeheartedly is saying, this is a great thing. This is wonderful. So now I'm just going to kind of conclude with three events where are decisive, where Washington kind of, plays a particular role, just to see how he deals with it. So when all this is going on with France, of course, the French send over this guy, Citizen Genet, Edmund Genet. So he is going to try to rabble rouse these kind of crowds and mobs in support of France, and he's going to do it over the head of Washington. That's his plan. So when Washington does the proclamation of neutrality in April 1793. Genet says, well, the true Republicans triumph. He's talking about his rallies and, et cetera, in Philadelphia. But the old Washington, le vieux Washington, a man very different from the character emblazoned in history, cannot forgive me for my successes with the eagerness to which the whole city rushed to my house, while a mere handful of English merchants rushed to congratulate him on his proclamation, right? And this starts getting really dicey because this guy is recruiting American merchant ships to outfit as warships and attack the British. He's doing this like right in the United States. So at a certain point, Washington says to Jefferson, or writes to Jefferson, says, is the minister of the French Republic to set the acts of this government at defiance with impunity and then threaten the executive with an appeal to the people? And this is where you have the cartoon of Washington's head in a guillotine, this broadside called The Funeral Dirge of Washington, James Wilson King. And it really gets nasty. Now, again, Washington doesn't, he's being careful. He can't, he's not about to insult the French government and ruin all relations and get into some kind of conflict. On the other hand, when it gets to this point, he sends a message off to France saying, you got to recall this guy. He's directly interfering with our governmental affairs. Now, here's the fun part, I think. So while Genet's here, the government in France changes. Of course, it changes all the time because it's this crazy mob revolution, right? And Genet is considered by the new government to be an enemy of the revolution and condemned to death. So what does Washington do? He grants him asylum and allows him to become an American citizen. It's perfect. This is a great American story, right? That is the plaque in East Greenbush, New York. Those familiar with New York State know that that's just the southeast of Albany, New York, is where Citizen Genet, he settled there, got married, had a family, etc. Happy ending for everybody. That's Washington. And I don't know if that was the first commutation as a president, not commutation, obviously, but a lot, granting asylum, but he did it, and others did it following him. Okay, then around the same period, you have the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, Washington is aptly convinced that this is part of the same thing. He believes that this is a work of these self-created societies. He's talking about the Jacobin clubs and whatnot. So the story is a bunch of these guys out in Western Pennsylvania. They don't want to pay the whiskey tax, which is part of the taxing system to fund the federal government. And Washington said, and then they take up arms and I forget it is, they raid the house of the local tax collector. They burn it down. It becomes nasty. A la, Shelburne's mobs and the French Jacobin mob, model. So Washington says, okay, we're going to reconstitute the army. We'll reconstitute the army. He ultimately mobilizes a force of with militia, about 13,000 men. He leads it. This is usually left out. They say, well, Hamilton, he leads it. Why? Because he leaves Pennsylvania. He's with his nice horse, and he knows if he starts going through the Pennsylvania and he gets all the way to Carlisle, crowds are going to come out because it's Washington. They love him, right? So this kind of puts a damper on the whole thing. And then when they get to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is near Gettysburg, for those that know the Civil War history in Gettysburg, they send out two negotiators from the rebels. They see the army and they say, "Oh my God, we're gonna get slaughtered." So they say, "Okay, Uncle, we'll pay the tax." And so Washington says, okay, fine, but there has to be trials. There are, this is illegal. You can't just have a little group of people determining what the whole country does. So they arrest like 130 people, something like that. They condemn 2 to death. And what does Washington do? He commutes the sentence, which, by the way, he did many, 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 many times as a general. When men were, military justice is brutal, right? So you fall asleep at guard duty and, you get shot the next day. So Washington would continuously commute these sentences, these death sentences. And he did that here. And nobody died. Nobody died. He didn't go in there and, blow them out of the water like Marco Rubio. That's not what his approach was. Okay, and then finally, this whole controversy around the Jay Treaty. Jay Treaty was very unpopular. It was the treaty with Great Britain because people thought that, and also this was used as another pretext to accuse Washington and Hamilton of being monarchists and pro-British and all bunk. But what happens is that Madison, who now is fully in this Jefferson camp, the kind of leader of the House of Representatives, he says, okay, we're going to get Washington on this one. We're going to set we're going to set an example for history where the House is going to exercise authority over the president. So now, of course, the treaties are done by the Senate and the president, and it's all confidential. And the Jay Treaty was done with Washington, Hamilton, and Jay going over there to London and negotiating the treaty. So it's supposed to be secret. So Madison says, okay, well, you know what? You need funding for the treaty because there's provisions of the treaty that needed funding, building forts, doing this, doing that, etc. We're not going to give you the funding. We're not, and we want to see all the papers, all the discussions. And Washington says the following, which are the quotes, and you see on the left there, Jay being burned in effigy, right, by Americans. So Washington says, from the first moment and from the fullest conviction in my own mind, I had resolved to resist the principle which was evidently to be established by this action of the House of Representatives. To admit then a right in the House of Representatives to demand all the papers respecting a negotiation with a foreign power would be to establish a dangerous precedent. So here's the House trying to set an example to exert authority over the executive, which is really unconstitutional. So Hamilton and his allies in Congress, Washington, they fight this tooth and nail from this standpoint, and they win. I think they win it by one vote. So this whole project to, again, undercut the powers of the presidency is defeated. Because Washington obviously knew exactly. Now, I just want to show this because it shows you this was all very public. This is not like some inside fighting that was going on. This is a cartoon from after Washington had resigned, from the presidency. His term had ended, and Adams is now the president. And there's a whole thing with France where we virtually almost got into a war with France, which I won't go into, but. So we had to constitute the army again in case we had to go to war with France. And Washington was called to be the commander-in-chief of this new army, which he said, okay, I have to serve my country again. So the cartoon shows Washington in the carriage. In front of him, the militia, the horses, etc., marching off. On the left, there are all the crazy Frenchmen cutting people's heads off, dancing around like clowns, like lunatics. That's on the left side, that whole left side of the cartoon. And then I have circled underneath, being trampled to death underneath the militia in Washington's army is Benjamin Franklin Bache, who is, of course, the author of the Aurora paper. And his Aurora paper is there with the dog peeing on it. And then on the right, you have Gallatin, who was then in the Congress, Genet, and Jefferson trying to pull the carriage back from attacking the French. So this became a very famous cartoon. So this is not some, All right, so Washington decides not to go for a third term, and he submits a farewell address. And of course, the farewell address is not addressed to anybody. There's no speech. It's not a speech. It's something that's to be printed. The first people that know that Washington is not going to run again and why and read the farewell address are the people. He sends it to various publications. It goes viral. People read it. And that's how the country knows he's not running again and what they should should get from his presidency. So he doesn't go to the Congress. He doesn't go to the cabinet. I mean, he probably did tell them. And Chris went through some of the quotes the last time. Since this is the second last slide, I'll read them quickly. It's worth, on unity, the name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. On the Constitution, this is important. The basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and alter their constitution of government. But the constitution which at any time exists till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people is sacredly obligatory upon all. So this is a beautiful kind of call to continue what he did in establishing the first government of the country. And then on parties, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be able to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government. And then, of course, there's the famous part about we shouldn't become entangled in foreign engagements. By the way, this was written and then, redone by Hamilton. So the farewell address is actually written by Hamilton and edited and embellished and whatnot by Washington. And then finally, we'll end with this. Some point during all of this, upheaval and these horrible things happening and attacks on Washington, Washington's getting another painting made of him by Trumbull. And he says to Trumbull, well, Trumbull's saying, my God, we're going to do this. It's horrible. They just did blah, blah, blah. Washington says, I trust that the good sense of our countrymen will guard the public weal against this and every other innovation, and that although we may be a little wrong now and then, we shall return to the right path with more avidity. And this is, of course, the idea of in order to form a more perfect union. So Washington was absolutely committed to the idea that this was the best government ever created. And if people could take that into their souls and actually internalize what it was and the principles, this was going to work. And we run into problems, we run into all stuff. And that's really what has happened. If you look at it, despite all the terrible things our country has become and the dumb things we've done, the people have done, it's still there, and it's, I think, ready to bubble up again. So anyway, so that's what I have.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'll bring Chris on as well. Yeah, there we go. So I guess this gives me lots of thoughts, but I'm going to turn it over to my husband. Go ahead.
Well, why don't you express your thoughts, and then we can just have a discussion. I think that would be.
Well, what particularly came to mind was that the Treaty of Westphalia was 1648. 1648. Yeah, 1648. That's what I meant. In the previous century to this, but not so far away as it was. And clearly, George Washington had a sense of this conception, the idea, not so much, in a sense, forgiveness, and that you needed the people, that you needed unity, and that you had a faith in the goodness of people. Like this character, Genet, what a scumbag, but they're not going to ship him off to France to be executed. He's welcome here. And the spirit even lasted, I think, until World War II, where I think there were many German prisoners of war who ended up in the United States who stayed. They were blown. We didn't torture them. I remember reading somewhere they said, and everyone was given a toothbrush. This it's very important because there's a great misconception right now, and I hear it from friends of ours, particularly some of the military people, Colonel Douglas McGregor, Senator Richard Black, saying, well, what we really need to do is the death penalty. The death penalty is going to deter crime. Now, of course, it never does, because what it does is it makes the government a criminal. The government then participates in murdering people, including its own citizens. And this is such an incredible lack of understanding of what motivates human beings, and what Lyndon LaRouche identified as the power of reason, because whether you behave principally with principle, whether you act for goodness and justice, nonetheless, it is written on your soul. You know what is just, you know what is good, and a leader exhibiting that quality has the power to evoke that in other people. So I just found that part of this very striking. And Tony Blair, we can think of him as explicit attack on the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia.
Yeah, the empire system. I mean, you think of well, what you referenced in terms of, I think you said World War II. The same in terms of the Revolution. That, you know, these Hessians were satanically brutal. I mean, they were over there as mercenaries for the British. They were basically sold into slavery to go and fight or die or whatever. Who cared what happened to them by the people that owned them, the lords who owned them. And they're over here and they're torturing, you know, priests to death in the Battle of Trenton and things like that. And then when they are defeated in the Battle of Trenton, Washington explicitly forbids the torture of any captives, no matter what hideous things they did to us. He forbade torture. And, you know, again, a lot of these Hessians did stay in the United States and become citizens of the United States because they realized this is a much better situation here than going back to being owned by some lord in Germany. So, yeah. And the other thing I was thinking about is this question of the entanglements, because this came up right away. The obviously the French, they played a major role in backing the revolutionaries, the Americans in the revolution. And had they not come in, it's pretty clear that it would have been more difficult to win the revolution. I mean, they certainly played a decisive role, in our victory. But this was organized by people. This was organized by Ben Franklin. This was organized by people like Lafayette, who was different than just a Frenchman or something, with his royal ambitions or something. I mean, Lafayette was a real human being, a real humanitarian, and he was, he was passionate about the American Revolution. And it's, just to give you a sense of what I want to do next on this question of Monroe, because what you see with Monroe and what you're going to see with Monroe is this battle for his soul, because he's taught by Jefferson. Jefferson is his teacher. Jefferson tries to recruit him to this disgusting outlook, this Jacobin outlook. And George Washington, so Monroe fights in the Battle of Trenton. He has an artery pierced by a bullet. He almost dies there. It's a miracle that he's saved. His life is saved. He goes on to, he also has to, he's given I think he becomes a colonel or something. Washington, I forget exactly, but he gets promoted in the military by Washington for his valor at Trenton, and he has to go back to Virginia to recruit troops. That's what his position gives him, is the right to, is the demand to go back and recruit troops, and he's not able to do it because he doesn't have any power to do it. He doesn't have any money. So this is in his mind, right? There's no power here to create an army, to create this nation. That's Monroe at an early age. He then goes back and fights in the Battle of Brandywine, where Lafayette is next to him, and Lafayette is wounded, and Monroe and Lafayette become very, very warm friends. But then, through the whole battle of the creation of the Constitution, Monroe is one of the key people in Virginia that rejects the Constitution, and he thinks it's too much power. He too much power in the hands of the federal government. But as time goes on, he becomes recruited to the federal government. In fact, it's right in this period that you're talking about, right after this period with Genet, where he's not sent back to the guillotine, that Washington sends Monroe as ambassador to France. And he gets there and he doesn't know what he's going to see. He gets there with his wife and I think his kid. And he's immediately struck with the horror of what he sees of people getting their heads chopped off left and right. So if this is what Jefferson was telling him was the great model, the revolutionary spirit, he was immediately confronted with the bloody reality of it and the fact that Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, is sitting in a prison cell. Her mother and grandmother had both just had their heads chopped off. And then he organizes saving Adrienne from a similar fate and has their son, gives their son, George Washington, I guess he becomes George Washington Lafayette, something like this. But anyway, he gives him a fake name with which to travel and get back.
That's his name.
Yeah, right. And George Washington Lafayette, he gives him a fake name with which to travel, and he gets to the United States. He saves his life too. But so we're going to see this development of what Washington represented, and how this then, even with somebody like Monroe, who's being recruited by the Jacobins, by the Jefferson, and of course Jefferson becomes president. This is a really interesting thing. He shifts to a certain extent once he becomes president of the United States, because now you can't be a Jacobin, or it's not so easy anyway. You actually have to think about the nation, and Monroe is one of the key people that organizes the Louisiana Purchase. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this question of the presidency goes forward with Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and the fight against this party system. Also the way that the British and the French and foreign nations would play the parties against each other. And we see that now. We see how, the British are still doing that. Israel, to a certain extent, they're basically run by the British as well, but playing parties against each other. Monroe is one of the key people that essentially wipes out the party system, at least for a period, for a very important period, as we will see, from Monroe, 2 terms of Monroe and 1 term of John Quincy Adams. This will be a remarkable period of development of the nation that George Washington would smile on from heaven. So
I just want to come back again to what Diane brought up, because this belies this whole ridiculous idea that you beat the crap out of somebody and you threaten them with punishing them, and that's the way you're going to be the president and get your way and do the right thing for the people. This is complete crap. Nobody's going to accuse Washington of being a Nancy, of being a sissy, okay? But he didn't operate. He was animated by a higher one. That's the idea, and that's what Chris is saying. That, when you get in a position where you become animated by this higher idea of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, for real, that becomes your identity. You have to drop these things. You have to do good things for people in the world, and that's what we see with the great presidents. At some point, look at Lincoln, 1836. He gets up and gives a speech saying, "Oh my God, the whole thing is being lost. We're going to lose the country. The Declaration, Washington, the Constitution. I'm going to commit my life to breathing life back into this. That's what I'm going to do." 1836, right? When he's a young man in Illinois. FDR. I mean, all the great presidents, and what Chris is saying, of course, about Monroe. And that's beautiful. It's a beautiful idea, I think.
I want to go back to also what you were discussing about the powers of the president, because we tend not to, people have an idea, well, it's always been this way, or how the advice and consent, I think, is really important. The precedent that the Congress doesn't have the right to know every detail of what a president negotiates with a foreign power, a foreign leader. I was thinking about the first time that President Trump met with Putin in his first term, and I had the feeling that the Congress and the media were about to demand that the interpreters be waterboarded to spit out what the conversation had. It's so outrageous because there are certain things about in the domain of the sovereign individual human mind, the individual representing the government in that way. And I will say, since the topic of Nicholas of Cusa has emerged again, the question, what is this relationship, the consent of the governed? But it doesn't mean you have a pure democracy where everybody who doesn't know anything about certain matters gets a right to vote on them, that you are trusting a sovereign individual in whose judgment you have some faith.
Yep. Yeah, and they acted like as if the American people had nothing to do with the election of this person who's representing them. We should know this. Well, no, wait a minute. This is the person we elected to represent the United States. This is the president of the United States, right? It's a powerful thing. Now, you hope to God that the president, actually lives up to that. And if they don't, then you have to perhaps run for office yourself.
I mean, it's really important to think about Lyndon LaRouche from this standpoint. I mean, he could have continued to be a consulting engineer. He could have just joined the socialists and become a left-wing radical or whatever, right? He could have started No, he ran for president. He ran for the president of the United States, and he was totally committed from 1976 until he died, right? That this institution was going to be saved and protected. He defended Nixon from the impeachment. Why? Because he liked Nixon? No, because he was defending the presidency. We defended, violations of the presidency when Obama was the president. Bush of all people, who we despise. We disagree with everything. And then of course Trump. So LaRouche, there's a reason that's what he did with his life. He was gonna be the presidential candidate, like Lincoln, et cetera, FDR, to maintain this standard. And Americans have to come to grips, which I think we can now. People can begin to realize that's actually what was going on here. But it's important to think about that, I think.
And I think this divide, the other thing that came across during George Washington's presidency is everything wasn't black and white and clear the way you described these people who appeared to be anti-monarchy.
Right.
But that didn't mean they had a conception of the republic or that they believed in a strong executive, which also is not the same thing as a unitary executive.
Right.
There's checks and balances throughout the whole.
Which is a fascist idea, unitary.
Right. Napoleon.
Yeah, you're actually required to think. I remember the science teacher I used to have, and he would always come in and he'd get really angry. He said, "You've got to think. You've got to think."
It's very good advice.
What we used to call the tyranny of reason. Remember the tyranny of reason? And that's really what all these people are reacting to.
Yes. Well, we're getting up on time. Is there anything you want to say in conclusion, Bob? And then maybe Chris can give us a preview of the next one.
He just did.
I know.
That's Monroe, and then we're going to do John Quincy Adams. But we're definitely going to do the Monroe thing. I think from the way that Chris was describing it. But I think the way that the idea of the 250th celebration should be this. I mean, people should be watching these things, arguing, disagreeing, having debates. You don't really see that. I haven't seen it. There's some kind of like fluff and we're all for this, etc. But the substance of it and what it means now and where the nation has to go. Right. I think that's the subject of all this? Where are we going in light of this extraordinary history? So I think that's the way that any person can address it. Go read the Federalist Papers. It's funny. This little story. I was at one of these historic sites in Dutchess County, and James Fenimore Cooper came up for a specific reason, which I won't go through. And the lady, who was really knowledgeable, like a boomer lady, maybe like my age, really knowledgeable, knew all this stuff, said, "No, yeah, and that Fenimore Cooper, the spy." And I said, "Oh yeah," and I said, "Oh yeah, the spy." And she goes, "Yeah, I tried to read that. It's in Old English. It's very hard to read." I'm saying Old English. That's Chaucer. This isn't. So
Right.
People, it's really serious. They can't read these things. They actually can't read the Federalist Papers. That's a crime. So we could have a whole project. Kids in high school should be reading these things, and they'd actually know how to actually think and speak in English. That would be nice.
Sure would.
So anyway, that's just my thoughts. I think that's what people should be doing over the next year and a half as we celebrate this 250th anniversary. So
Sure. Chris?
Well, just that yes, because the issue is, as I believe John Segerson said, that the way we should think about the celebration of this 250th is the next 250.
Right.
And now we've really got to revive that spirit of Washington and the presidency if this nation, if this republic will be kept, as Franklin said to the lady outside of the convention.
Yes, I think this is really important. And we have to remember that there had never been such a republic before.
Right.
The work of Joan of Arc, Louis XI, there was Nicholas of Cusa. There was beginning to be a kind of a cloud of a formation of such a thing. But the driving thought was now not how do we govern ourselves? The thought was, how should mankind live? How should mankind progress? If you truly believe that every single human being is born with an innate, God-given, equal potential, then how should our human species live on this planet? And can you establish a social formation which allows for the maximum freedom of the individual within the functioning of a society as a whole, which of course allows the maximum freedom, because if you're just out there in the woods by yourself, you're not going to have time to think or become a scientist or anything else. And I think this also gets at why Ben Franklin was so intrigued with Confucius and the Chinese model of society, which I'm sure affected his thinking of the formation of the American government. So I think this is just something very rich. We have to think about this during this 250-year anniversary.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up actually, because Washington wrote that little book. Has anybody ever seen that on rules of conduct?
Oh yeah,
It was big and it's really Confucian. You have to govern yourself first. If you can't govern yourself and your emotions, you can't govern your family. If you can't govern your family, you can't govern your city, and then you can't govern the country. And that goes back around. It's all one thing. And this is Confucius. So I don't know if he had discussions with Franklin on that, but that's the way he lived.
Wow.
Anyway, so it's very interesting. People should get that book and look at it.
Yes, so more to come. So please, everyone, tune in next week. There is a conference in Paris, France, of young people, which will be taking up many of these questions, including the development of Africa, which is the future of the human race right now. Africa will have 2.5 billion people in that continent by 2050. And then as we continue forward, please write to info@LaRoucheOrganization.com if you have particular ideas and thoughts about America's 250th revolution, 250th anniversary of the revolution. And please subscribe for $10 a month or more. You will get the daily alert of Executive Intelligence Review. And of course, you're welcome to donate as much as you like. So thanks for watching, and we'll be back next week.